Hey everyone. My name is Tyler Vance. I'm 32 years old, and a few years ago, my own father shoved me into a decorative fountain at my brother's wedding, in front of 200 guests, simply because I showed up alone. Before I tell you about the moment my wife walked in and wiped the smiles off every single face in that room, do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Alright, so let's get right into it. The water was shockingly cold. It was one of those ornate, three-tiered stone fountains you see at fancy wedding venues, the kind with little cherubs spitting arcs of water into a wide basin. 1 second, I was standing on the manicured lawn, the crisp evening air doing little to cool the hot sting of my father's words. The next, I was stumbling backward, my expensive dress shoes finding no purchase on the slick marble edge. The world tilted, a dizzying blur of fairy lights and horrified/amused faces. And then came the splash. Icy water shot up my nose and soaked through my suit in an instant, plastering my hair to my forehead. For a split second, there was dead silence. The kind of silence that's so loud it hums. Then, a single person started clapping. I don't know who it was. It didn't matter, because that one clap broke the dam, and suddenly the air was filled with laughter and applause. Not polite chuckles. Real, hearty, belly laughs. They were laughing at me. I pushed myself up, my knees scraping against the rough bottom of the fountain. Water streamed from my hair, down my face, and dripped from the hem of my jacket. I looked out at the sea of faces. My mother, Eleanor, stood beside my father, a hand covering her mouth, but her eyes weren't filled with shock or concern. They were filled with embarrassment. My younger brother, Leo, the golden boy, the groom, stood with his new husband, Sebastian, looking anywhere but at me. My father, Richard Vance, a man who commanded courtrooms with his booming voice and sharp intellect, stood there with a triumphant smirk on his face. He was a successful lawyer, and appearances were everything to him. My very existence, in his eyes, was a stain on the perfect family portrait he tried to paint. He couldn't even get a date, he'd bellowed, the words echoing across the patio just before the shove. Soaking wet, humiliated, and chilled to the bone, I did the one thing they didn't expect. I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, tight curve of my lips. I met my father's gaze, holding it until he started to look uncomfortable. Then, in a voice just loud enough to carry over the dying laughter, I said, "Don't forget this moment." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A seed planted in the most toxic soil imaginable. I knew something they didn't. I knew that in approximately 20 minutes, the entire power dynamic of the Vance family was about to be rewritten forever. And I was going to enjoy every second of it. To understand how we got to that point, how a father could do that to his son, you have to understand the family I grew up in. You have to understand what it's like to be the shadow. Growing up in the Vance household was like living in a perpetual spotlight that was always pointed somewhere else. Specifically, it was pointed at my younger brother, Leo. From the moment he was born, Leo was the sun, and I was just a planet caught in his orbit, invisible without his reflected light. It wasn't that my parents were overtly cruel in the beginning. It was a quieter, more insidious kind of neglect. It was the constant comparison. "Why can't you be more like your brother, Tyler?" That was my mother's favorite refrain. She'd say it when I brought home a B+ on a report card, while Leo's straight A paper was already framed on the mantelpiece. She'd say it when I struggled to make small talk at her stuffy dinner parties, while Leo, even as a kid, could charm a room full of adults with a story and a bright smile. My father was worse. He didn't just compare, he dismissed. My achievements weren't just lesser. They were practically non-existent. I was a decent athlete in high school. I made the varsity soccer team as a sophomore, which was a pretty big deal at my school. I'll never forget the regional semifinal. I scored the winning goal in the final 2 minutes. My teammates lifted me onto their shoulders. The crowd was cheering, and for one brief, shining moment, I felt seen. I scanned the stands for my parents, my heart pounding with hope. They weren't there. I found out later they'd driven 2 hours in the opposite direction to watch Leo perform a 5-minute piano recital. A recital, not even a competition. When I got home, buzzing with my victory, my father was on the phone, telling one of his law partners about Leo's prodigious talent. I stood in the doorway, my cleats still on, holding my muddy jersey. He glanced at me, said, "Oh, Tyler, you're home. How was your game?" Before turning back to the phone. He never asked if we won. The most painful memory, the one that really cemented my place in the family, happened on my 16th birthday. It was a Wednesday. I came home from school expecting maybe a cake, a small celebration. Instead, I walked into the living room to find my father, my mother, and Leo all gathered around the coffee table. An official-looking envelope lying open. "Tyler, you're not going to believe this," my mother chirped, her eyes shining. "Leo's been accepted into the Yale Young Global Scholars Program for the summer." My father clapped Leo on the back, beaming. "That's my boy, an Ivy League man before he even graduates high school. This is the start of something big, son." I just stood there. "It's my birthday," I said softly. My father waved a dismissive hand. "Yes, yes, happy birthday. Now look at this. This is a real achievement." He picked up the letter, his pride practically radiating off him. He started talking about Leo's college fund, how they'd have to make sure it was robust enough for the Ivy League track. A clear signal about where the family's resources and attention were directed. They forgot. They completely forgot my birthday. Later that evening, my mom quietly slid a store-bought cupcake with a single sad-looking candle onto my desk. "Sorry, honey," she whispered. "It's just been a very exciting day." That was the day I stopped trying. I stopped trying to win their approval because I finally understood it was a game I was never meant to win. Leo was the golden son, the one who would carry on the family name and reputation. I was just Tyler, the quiet one, the disappointment, the shadow. And a shadow can't compete with the sun. It can only detach itself and find its own source of light. So that's exactly what I decided to do. The best day of my young life was the day I packed my bags for college. I didn't go far, just a state university a few hours away, but it felt like moving to another planet. For the first time, I wasn't Leo's older brother. I was just Tyler. The freedom was intoxicating. I threw myself into my studies, political science and economics. I made friends who liked me for my dry sense of humor and my loyalty, not for my family's name. My parents paid my tuition, of course. It was part of keeping up appearances. But their involvement ended there. They visited my campus exactly once in 4 years, for a mandatory parents' weekend, where they spent most of the time talking about Leo's upcoming debate tournament. After graduation, the real break began. While Leo went straight to a prestigious law school, following in my father's footsteps, I took a different path. I told my family I got a boring entry-level analyst job with the government in DC. It was vague, unimpressive, and perfectly designed to make them lose interest. An analyst? My father had scoffed over the phone. "What's the salary on a job like that? You'll be living on ramen noodles, boy. Leo's summer internship at the firm pays more than that." "It's stable, Richard," my mother had said, which was her way of calling it mediocre. What I didn't tell them was that my boring analyst job was a recruitment program for one of the country's most discreet intelligence agencies. I wasn't analyzing spreadsheets. I was analyzing geopolitical threats. The work was demanding, intense, and deeply fulfilling. I was good at it. I was more than good. I was exceptional. In the quiet, high-stakes world of national security, my ability to fade into the background, to observe and connect disparate pieces of information, wasn't a flaw. It was a superpower. For the first time, I was judged solely on my merit. My name didn't matter. My family's expectations didn't exist. All that mattered was my mind and my work ethic. I started to build a life, a real one, completely separate from the Vances. I got a small apartment in Arlington, made friends with my colleagues, people who understood the pressures of our work, and slowly the wounds of my childhood began to scar over. The distance helped. I'd call home once a week, listen to the latest news about Leo's triumphs in law school, offer non-committal answers about my own life, and hang up. They didn't push. Why would they? They thought I was a paper pusher in some forgotten government basement. Years later, I found out from a cousin that an old high school acquaintance, a guy named Julian who was always jealous of my family's money, had run into my parents at some event. He'd worked a temp job in my building for a few weeks and told them he'd seen me getting coffee. Yeah, Tyler's in the records department, I think. He'd lied, probably to make himself feel better. Lots of filing. Seems content. My parents ate it up. It confirmed every low expectation they had of me. The quiet disappointment, the son who never launched. It fit their narrative perfectly. Little did they know that very week I had been in a secure room, briefing a congressional committee on a sensitive foreign matter. My so-called failure was the best cover I could have ever asked for. I was living a double life, and in one of those lives, I was finally becoming the man I was always meant to be. For years, my work was my entire world. The hours were long, the stakes were high, and personal attachments were complicated. I dated occasionally, but it never went far. How could it? I could never fully explain what I did, where I went, or why I had to cancel plans at the last minute. It was a lonely existence, but it was mine. Then I met Aerys. It was at a cybersecurity conference in Geneva. I wasn't there as a presenter. I was an observer, tasked with identifying emerging threats in the tech sector. She was the keynote speaker, Dr. Aerys Thorne, a prodigy who had earned her PhD from MIT at 22 and founded Thorne Dynamics, a company that was revolutionizing AI and quantum computing. She was brilliant, commanding, and had a presence that filled the entire auditorium. She was in every way the sun. But this time I wasn't afraid of the light. We met during a coffee break. I had made a quiet comment to a colleague about a flaw in one of the presented algorithms, and she happened to be standing behind me. "You're the first person here who's mentioned that," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum. "I've been waiting for someone to bring it up." We talked for the rest of the conference. It was electric. She didn't just listen to my ideas. She challenged them, built on them, and saw the patterns I was seeing. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone was speaking the same language as me. She was sharp and funny, and completely unimpressed by titles or status. She was interested in how my mind worked. We started a long-distance relationship, a whirlwind of encrypted emails, secure video calls from opposite ends of the globe, and secret weekend meetings in cities where neither of us had any ties. I told her the truth about my job. Not the classified details, but the nature of it, the secrecy, the pressure. She wasn't scared off. She understood. Her own work was under constant threat from industrial espionage and foreign powers. She lived in a world of NDAs and security details. After 18 months, during a rare, quiet weekend in a small coastal town in Portugal, she proposed to me. "We're a team, Tyler," she said simply. "The best one I've ever been on. I want to make it official." We got married a month later at a small, private ceremony in a New York City courthouse. Our only witnesses were my closest colleague and friend, Ben Carter, and her head of security. We didn't tell our families. For me, the reason was obvious. I didn't want to subject Aerys to their judgment, their inevitable comparisons to Leo, their confusion over why a woman like her would choose someone like me. I wanted to protect what we had from their toxicity. For Aerys, it was a matter of security. Her work made her a target. The fewer public connections she had, the safer she was. A secret marriage to a quiet government employee was the perfect arrangement. So, for 3 years, we lived as husband and wife in private. We built a life together behind the scenes, a partnership of equals based on deep mutual respect and love. She was my anchor, the one person in the world who saw me for exactly who I was. "You are the most extraordinary man I've ever met, Tyler Vance," she told me one night, tracing patterns on my hand. "I hope you know that." And with her, I was finally starting to believe it, which brought me back to the present. Standing in my hotel room, looking at the crisp, formal invitation to the wedding of my brother, Leo Vance, to the Honorable Sebastian Croft. It was time for the two halves of my life to collide. The wedding was held at a sprawling vineyard estate in Napa Valley, the kind of place where old money and new tech fortunes collided. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and entitlement. I arrived alone, just as I said I would. Aerys was flying in from a last-minute business emergency in Seoul and was scheduled to land just after the ceremony started. We'd planned it that way. A quiet entrance for her, a final test for me. The moment I stepped out of the cab, I felt it, the collective shift in atmosphere. The polite smiles that became a little too tight, the eyes that lingered a moment too long. I was the family smudge, the unpolished blemish on a day that was supposed to be perfect. At the reception, a seating chart as ornate as a medieval scroll confirmed my status. At the head of the ballroom, sparkling under a crystal chandelier, was Table 1, the family table. My parents, Leo and Sebastian, Sebastian's wealthy parents. The other top-tier tables were filled with society friends and business titans. And then there was my assignment, Table 19, tucked away near the service entrance, next to the speakers pumping out string quartet music a little too loudly. It was the island of misfit toys, populated by a great-aunt who was hard of hearing, a couple of my parents' neighbors they felt obligated to invite, and me. Tyler, darling, I almost didn't recognize you. The voice belonged to my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. She was a woman who weaponized sweetness. She squeezed my arm, her rings digging into my skin. You came all this way by yourself? Oh, you poor thing, she cooed, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Still haven't found a nice girl to settle down with? Don't you worry. It happens for some people later in life. Or, not at all, I suppose. I just smiled politely. It's good to see you too, Aunt Carol. For the next hour, it was a slow-motion assault of 1,000 tiny cuts. Cousins I hadn't seen in years would come by, pat me on the shoulder, and ask what I was up to these days. When I gave them my standard vague answer about government work, they'd get a pitying look in their eyes and quickly change the subject to Leo's recent promotion at his prestigious law firm. He's on track to make partner before he's 30, one uncle proudly announced. Runs in the family, that ambition. He winked, clearly not including me in that statement. I saw my mother, Eleanor, floating through the room, a perfect hostess in a silk gown. She'd catch my eye, give a weak, strained smile, and then immediately turn to laugh at a joke from one of her friends. She didn't come to my table once. She was a master of plausible deniability. She could ignore me while being in the same room, making it look like she was just a busy mother of the groom. But I knew the truth. She was ashamed of me. I was the living, breathing evidence that her family wasn't as perfect as she pretended. I nursed a glass of club soda, the ice cubes clinking, a lonely sound in the sea of chatter. This was my family, a collection of people bound by blood, but not by love or respect. Not for me, anyway. I was an anecdote they would tell later. Can you believe Tyler showed up alone? So sad. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the ghost of a boy who just wanted his parents to be proud of him. But that boy was long gone. The man in his place was just waiting. The clock was ticking. The clinking of a spoon against a champagne flute silenced the room. My father, Richard Vance, stood at the podium, his posture immaculate in his custom-tailored tuxedo. He beamed, a proud patriarch surveying his kingdom. Good evening, everyone, he began, his voice resonating with the practiced confidence of a trial lawyer. Eleanor and I are just so thrilled to welcome you all here tonight to celebrate the union of our wonderful son, Leo, and the newest member of our family, Sebastian. He went on for a few minutes, telling a charming, sanitized story about Leo's childhood. He talked about Leo's drive, his ambition, his unerring ability to succeed at everything he tried. Every word was a polished stone, carefully chosen to build a monument to his perfect son. I sat at table 19, a ghost at the feast watching the performance. When you have children, my father continued, his eyes sweeping the room, you have dreams for them. You dream they'll be happy, successful, and a source of pride. You want them to find a partner who complements them, who makes them better. And in Sebastian, Leo has found just that. He raised his glass. Leo and Sebastian are a perfect match. They are both driven, both successful, both a credit to their families. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Then he looked out into the crowd, and for a fraction of a second his eyes met mine. A flicker of something cold and hard passed through them before he looked away. "You know," he said, a slight edge creeping into his voice, "not every child lives up to the potential you see in them. Some take a different path, a quieter path. But as parents, we are proud of the ones who truly shine, the ones who make the right choices, who build a life worth celebrating." The implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. The room grew quiet. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They all knew who he was talking about. He wasn't just toasting Leo. He was publicly shaming me. He was using his son's wedding speech to draw a line in the sand. On one side, the brilliant, successful son, and on the other, the failure. "So I ask you all to join me in raising a glass," he concluded, his smile returning, wider and more triumphant than before. "To Leo, the son who has never, ever let us down. And to Sebastian, welcome to the family." The room erupted in applause and cheers of, "To Leo and Sebastian." I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. My hands were steady. My face was a mask of polite indifference. But inside, something had finally snapped. The years of quiet dismissals, of being overlooked and undervalued, had coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just about favoritism anymore. This was a deliberate act of cruelty. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to make an example of me. He wanted to ensure that everyone in his world knew that I was nothing. And as I set my glass down, I made a silent vow. He would get his wish. He would have a moment of pure, unadulterated humiliation. It just wasn't going to be mine. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt thick, suffocating. I needed to get out. I pushed my chair back quietly and slipped out onto the terrace. The cool night air a welcome relief. The party continued behind me, a muffled symphony of laughter and music. I leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out at the rows of grapevines disappearing into the darkness. I was trying to breathe, trying to keep the cold anger that was churning in my gut from boiling over. The glass doors slid open behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "There you are." My father's voice was low and menacing. "What are you doing? Sulking out here? Ruining your brother's wedding photos with your long face?" "I was just getting some air," I said, my voice flat. I didn't turn to face him. "Getting some air," he mocked. "You're an embarrassment, Tyler. Do you have any idea how it looks? My eldest son, showing up alone, hiding in the shadows. People are talking. They're pitying us. Pitying me. I don't think anyone's thinking about you, Dad," I said, the words sharper than I intended. That was a mistake. I heard his footsteps, quick and heavy on the flagstones. He grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. His face was flushed with anger and too much expensive wine. His eyes, which were a paler blue version of my own, were narrowed into slits. "Don't you take that tone with me," he snarled. "I've given you everything. A good home, a great education. And this is how you repay me? By being a complete and utter nobody? 32 years old and you have nothing to show for it. No career to speak of. No prospects. You can't even find a date to your own brother's wedding." His voice was getting louder, attracting the attention of a few guests who had wandered outside to smoke or take calls. They were starting to watch. Good. Let them watch. "My life is not your personal report card," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Your life is a reflection on me," he roared, jabbing a finger into my chest. "And it's a failing grade." He was completely losing control, the carefully constructed facade of the powerful lawyer crumbling to reveal the ugly, insecure man beneath. He saw the guests watching, and instead of backing down, he decided to double down, to play to the audience. "Look at you," he shouted, his voice echoing across the patio. "My son, the failure." And then he shoved me, hard, with both hands against my chest. My body was already off balance, and his push was all it took. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling, my arms windmilling uselessly in the air. For the second time that night, the world turned upside down. I saw a flash of my father's furious face, my mother's horrified gasp from the doorway, and the wide, shocked eyes of the onlookers. Then, the cold embrace of the fountain swallowed me whole. The shock of the water, the roar of laughter, the applause. It all came back, just as I described. But this time, when I pushed myself up, dripping and disgraced, I did something I hadn't mentioned. As I stood there, I subtly lifted my gaze past the stunned crowd, up to the top floor of the main estate building. I looked at the large window of the presidential suite, where a single light had just been turned on. And though I couldn't see her, I knew she was there. I knew Aerys was watching, and I gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. The show was about to begin. Walking back into that ballroom was one of the longest walks of my life. Every step was a squelch. Water dripped from my suit, leaving a dark trail on the polished hardwood floor. The music had faltered. The lively chatter had died. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. It was like walking through a photograph. People stood frozen, champagne flutes halfway to their lips, faces a mixture of shock, pity, and poorly concealed amusement. My father had followed me in. He stood near the entrance, breathing heavily, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had won. In his mind, he had put me in my place publicly and definitively. He had demonstrated his power. My mother rushed to his side, whispering frantically, but he just shrugged her off. I ignored them all. I ignored the whispers that started to ripple through the crowd as I passed. Did you see that? Richard actually pushed him. Deserved it, if you ask me. So pathetic. Can you imagine the humiliation? I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. My destination was the bar at the far end of the room. I walked with a purpose I hadn't felt all night. This wasn't a walk of shame. It was a countdown. The bartender, a young man with wide, terrified eyes, stared at me as I approached. Could I get a glass of water, please? I asked, my voice perfectly level. He fumbled with a glass, his hands shaking slightly as he filled it from a pitcher. He slid it across the bar as if I were radioactive. I took it, my own hand perfectly steady, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I leaned against the polished wood of the bar, turning my body just enough to survey the room. I let them stare. I let them whisper. I wanted them to remember this moment clearly. Me, dripping wet, abandoned by my family, seemingly at my lowest point. My cousin Chloe, one of the few decent ones, started to walk towards me, her face etched with concern. But her mother, Aunt Carol, grabbed her arm and pulled her back, shaking her head. No one was to associate with the outcast. I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. It was an older, unassuming model, but it was military-grade encrypted. A single text message was on the screen. ETA 2 minutes. Asset is in position. I typed a one-word reply. Proceed. I slipped the phone back into my wet pocket and took another sip of water. I looked up and caught my father's eye from across the room. He gave me a look of pure contempt. I simply raised my glass in a silent, ironic toast. He had no idea what was coming. The air in the room was thick with tension, a heavy, static charge just waiting for a spark. And the spark was about to walk through the door. The grand oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were closed. They had been for the past hour, sealing us all inside this little theater of family dysfunction. Suddenly, without a knock or a warning, the left door swung inward with a quiet, authoritative push. A man stepped into the doorway. He wasn't a guest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a simple, impeccably tailored black suit. An almost invisible earpiece curled into one ear. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his eyes scanning the room with a calm, professional detachment. He was assessing, cataloging, securing. A nervous murmur went through the crowd. Who was he? Was he with the venue? Before anyone could answer, the right door swung open. A second man, identical in dress and demeanor, stepped in and took up a position on the other side of the doorway. They stood like sentinels, framing the entrance. The string quartet, which had awkwardly started playing again, faltered into silence one last time. Every single person in the room was now staring at the open doorway, waiting. I saw my father frown. His lawyer instincts were kicking in. This was an unscheduled interruption. It was a breach of his carefully planned event. He started to walk towards the men, his face darkening. "Excuse me," he said, his voice back in its commanding courtroom tone. "Who are you? This is a private event." The man on the left didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on something behind my father, out in the hall. He just raised a hand, a quiet, simple gesture that said, "Stay back." My father stopped dead in his tracks, utterly stunned. No one told Richard Vance to stay back. He was about to protest, to pull rank and demand answers, but the words died in his throat, because that's when she walked in. She moved through the doorway and into the center of the room, flanked by her 2 security men. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. She was magnetism personified. She wore a simple, elegant dark blue dress that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the entire scene in a single sweeping glance. She radiated an aura of power and confidence that made everyone else in the room, with all their inherited wealth and blustering egos, seem small and insignificant. Her eyes scanned the crowd, passed over my dumbstruck parents, over the shocked faces of the guests, and finally, they landed on me, leaning against the bar, soaking wet. A flicker of something, anger, concern, resolve, passed through her gaze. Then, her expression softened into one of pure, unadulterated affection. She started walking towards me, her heels clicking softly on the floor, the only sound in the dead-silent room. The entire party parted for her like the Red Sea, and I knew right then that nothing would ever be the same again. She walked straight to me, her eyes never leaving mine. It felt like we were the only 2 people in the room. The air around us was a bubble of silence, while outside it, I could hear the frantic whispers starting up again. "Who is that? I've seen her before. On the cover of a magazine. Look at her security. Is she a celebrity?" She reached the bar and stopped in front of me. She gently reached out and brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from my forehead. Her touch was warm. "Are you okay, my love?" she asked, her voice low and steady, meant only for me. "I'm fine," I murmured back. "You're right on time." Behind her, the whispers were getting louder. I saw Sebastian, my brother's new husband, staring with wide eyes. One of his groomsmen, a tech venture capitalist from Palo Alto, grabbed his arm, his face pale. "Sebastian," the groomsman hissed, his voice carrying in the silent room. "Do you know who that is? That's Aerys Thorne. Dr. Aerys Thorne, CEO of Thorne Dynamics. Her company is worth, God, I don't know, $100 billion? She's basically the female Elon Musk, but smarter." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Necks craned. iPhones were subtly being pulled out under tablecloths. My father, who had been frozen by the entrance, finally found his voice. He puffed out his chest and strode forward, trying to regain control. "Dr. Thorne," he said, forcing a welcoming smile that looked more like a grimace. "What an unexpected honor. I'm Richard Vance, Leo's father. I don't believe we were expecting you." Aerys didn't even turn to look at him. Her attention was still entirely on me. She shrugged off her light cashmere wrap and draped it over my soaked shoulders. It was an act of such simple, profound intimacy that it silenced the room more effectively than a gunshot. "I'm not here for the wedding," she said, her voice now clear and cool, carrying easily through the ballroom. She finally turned her head, her gaze pinning my father to the spot. It was like watching a shark look at a minnow. "I'm here for my husband." If the room had been quiet before, it was now a vacuum. The shock was absolute, a physical force that sucked the air from 200 lungs. My father's jaw literally dropped. His face went from confusion to utter, slack-jawed disbelief. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp and put a hand to her chest. Leo and Sebastian just stared, their faces identical masks of incomprehension. Aerys turned back to me, a small, sad smile on her lips. I saw what he did to you, Tyler. I was watching from the suite. I saw the whole thing. She then looked back at my father, and the warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by glacial ice. I saw you assault my husband, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. I saw you humiliate the best man I have ever known. And I promise you, Mr. Vance, you will come to regret that. The self-satisfied smirk that had been on my father's face all night had completely vanished. He looked small. He looked afraid. For the first time in his life, Richard Vance was completely and utterly out of his depth. Husband? My mother finally stammered, taking a shaky step forward. That's not possible. Tyler he works in a records department. She couldn't even finish the sentence. The idea was too preposterous. Aerys gave a small, humorless laugh. You really have no idea who your son is, do you? Before she could continue, the main doors, which her security had held open, admitted one more person. He was an older gentleman, probably in his late 60s, with silver hair and a quiet, undeniable air of authority. He wore a simple dark suit, but it fit him with the ease of a man accustomed to power. He was followed by my friend and colleague Ben Carter. The man walked calmly through the stunned crowd, his eyes finding me immediately. He gave a slight, respectful nod. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice calm but resonant. I'm sorry to interrupt. My father, desperate to seize on any semblance of normality, turned to the man. And who are you? He demanded, trying to sound forceful but just coming off as flustered. The man simply ignored him. His focus was entirely on me. Tyler, he said, his tone shifting to one of urgency. We have a situation developing with the consulate in Ankara. We need your directive immediately. The secretary is waiting for your go-ahead. My father blinked. Secretary? What secretary? What is he talking about, Tyler? I took a deep breath. This was it. The final curtain pull. Dad, I said, my voice steady. This is Mr. Sterling. He's my boss. Your boss. Richard scoffed, a hint of his old arrogance returning. Your boss from the filing department? Mr. Sterling's lips twitched in a brief, almost imperceptible smile. He turned his gaze to my father, and for the first time, Richard Vance seemed to understand that he was no longer the most important man in the room. Mr. Vance, Sterling said, his voice polite but with an undercurrent of steel. Your son hasn't worked in a filing department a day in his life. For the past 10 years, Tyler has been one of the lead strategic analysts for the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. For the last 2 years, since his promotion, he has served as a senior advisor, specializing in counterterrorism. His work has directly led to the prevention of no fewer than 4 major international incidents. His directives, as you so dismissively call them, have saved hundreds of American lives. The secretary we are referring to is the Secretary of State. A wave of pure, unadulterated shock silenced the room. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. The guests, my family, they all just stared, their minds struggling to process the information. The quiet failure of a son, the family joke. Was a national security advisor? Ben stepped forward and handed me a secure satellite phone. Ankara is on line 1, Tyler, he said, his voice all business. I took the phone. I turned my back on my family, on the whole sorry spectacle, and brought it to my ear. This is Vance, I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. Patch me through to the ambassador. Tell the secretary I'll have a recommendation for him in 5. I started walking away, towards a quiet corner of the room, Aerys at my side, my boss and my colleague flanking us. We were a unit, a team, the family I had chosen. I glanced back over my shoulder one last time. My father was pale as a ghost, his mouth hanging open. My mother looked like she was going to faint. And Leo just stared at me, his golden boy trophy suddenly looking like cheap plastic. He wasn't looking at his failure of a brother anymore. He was looking at a complete stranger. The phone call took exactly 4 minutes. It was a high-pressure situation involving a compromised asset, but it was nothing I hadn't handled before. My mind, trained for years to compartmentalize and focus under duress, locked onto the problem and solved it. I gave my directive, ended the call, and handed the phone back to Ben. The immediate crisis was averted. Now, I had to deal with the one raging in the ballroom. I turned back to face my family. Mr. Sterling had quietly explained to the security detail that we would be leaving shortly. The guests were starting to whisper again, but the tone had changed. The pity and mockery were gone, replaced by awe and confusion. They were all looking at me differently. They were looking at me with respect. I walked back towards my parents, who were standing frozen in the middle of the room, the epicenter of a blast zone they hadn't seen coming. Aerys was at my side, her hand resting protectively on the small of my back. My father was the first to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. A senior advisor? Counterterrorism? Why didn't you tell us? Would you have believed me? I asked the question genuine. Or would you have just called it another one of my fantasies? He had no answer. We're so proud of you, son, my mother said, her eyes welling up with tears. But they weren't tears of joy. They were tears of shock, of a world turned upside down. And that's when I knew. That's when I saw the truth with painful clarity. They weren't proud of me. They were proud of the title. They were proud of the status. They were proud of the reflection this new, impressive version of me cast back on them. The son they had spent a lifetime belittling was suddenly a source of bragging rights, and the whiplash was giving them vertigo. No, I said, my voice soft but firm, cutting through her sob. No, you're not. You've never been proud of me. You were proud of Leo. You were ashamed of me. You spent my entire life making sure I knew it. I looked directly at my father. You shoved your son into a fountain tonight because you thought he was a nobody. Does this? I said, gesturing vaguely to Mr. Sterling and the secure phone. Does this suddenly make that okay? Richard flinched as if I'd struck him. I didn't need you to be proud of my job, I continued, the words I'd held inside for 20 years finally coming out. I just needed you to be proud of your son. I just needed you to, like me. But that was too much to ask. I gave a small, sad shake of my head. It's okay. It's really okay. Because I don't need it anymore. I looked at Leo, who was staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I looked at my mother, who was openly weeping now. And I looked at my father, who for the first time in his life, looked utterly defeated. Enjoy the rest of the wedding, I said. Then I turned to Aerys. Let's go home. Together, we turned and walked towards the door, my team falling in step around us. We walked out of that ballroom, leaving my family to stand in the ruins of the world they had built. This was the moment that changed everything, the moment I finally took back control of my own life. Thank you for sticking with me this far, you're amazing. If you could, please help me out by liking this video and commenting the number 1 down below, just so I know you made it here with me. It doesn't just help more people find this story. It also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone out there. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. We didn't leave through the lobby. Ben and Mr. Sterling led us through a service corridor and up a private elevator. The plan had always been to depart discreetly. Aerys owned a stake in the hotel chain, and her helicopter was waiting on the roof's private helipad. The roar of the rotors grew louder as we ascended. When the elevator doors opened to the rooftop, the wind whipped at my still damp clothes. The lights of Napa Valley spread out below us like a blanket of scattered diamonds. The helicopter stood waiting, its blades a hypnotic blur. As I took a step towards it, a voice called my name. Tyler, wait! I turned. It was my mother. She must have run, completely abandoning her duties as hostess, to follow us. She stood in the elevator doorway, her elegant dress in disarray, her face streaked with tears. My father was not with her. Please, she said, taking a few hesitant steps onto the helipad, shouting to be heard over the noise. Please don't go. Not like this. We can talk. We can fix this. I stopped and looked at her. The wind and the noise created a strange, surreal bubble around us. "Fix what, Mom?" I shouted back. "Fix 30 years of neglect? Or just fix the fact that you're embarrassed about what just happened in front of all your friends?" "No!" she cried, shaking her head. "It's not that. I didn't know. We didn't know. If you had just told us." "Told you what?" countered, my voice raw. "That I was worthy of your love? That my life had value? Should I have had to submit a resume for you to approve of me as a son?" Her face crumpled. She had no answer. She just stood there, a pathetic and lost figure under the vast, dark sky. Aerys stepped forward and spoke, her voice cutting through the wind. "Eleanor," she said, using my mother's first name with a formality that was colder than any insult. "Your son is the most decent, brilliant, and honorable man I have ever known. You had the privilege of raising him, and you treated him like a burden. His success is not your victory. It is his and his alone." My mother looked from Aerys to me, her eyes pleading. "What do you want from me, Tyler? What can I do?" I looked at my mother, at this woman who had given me life but had withheld her heart, and I felt a profound sadness. "That depends," I called out, my voice tired. "Does it matter to you who I really am? Or does it only matter that the version of me you saw tonight finally meets your standards?" I didn't wait for an answer. I turned my back on her, took Aerys's hand, and walked into the waiting helicopter. As we lifted off, I looked down and saw her, a tiny, solitary figure on a rooftop, growing smaller and smaller until she was just another light in the valley, before disappearing completely into the darkness. A year can change everything. The 12 months that followed the wedding were a whirlwind of healing, rebuilding, and rediscovering what it meant to be a family. Aerys and I were no longer a secret. We didn't broadcast our lives, but we stopped hiding. We hosted small dinner parties at our home in D.C., a beautiful brownstone filled with books, art, and laughter. My friends, like Ben, became her friends, and her circle of brilliant, innovative colleagues embraced me. For the first time, my personal and professional lives were in harmony. It was a peaceful existence I never thought possible. My job, if anything, became more intense. After the Ankara incident, I was given even more responsibility, a significant promotion that came with a title that even my father, the lawyer obsessed with status, would have been impressed by. But I found that I didn't care about his approval anymore. I did the work because it mattered, because I was good at it, and because it was part of the life Aerys and I were building together. The Vance family, as I knew it, had imploded. The fallout from that night was catastrophic. According to my cousin Chloe, who called me a week after the wedding to offer a heartfelt apology for her silence over the years, the party had ended in a storm of recriminations. My father and mother had a spectacular fight, with decades of resentment pouring out. Leo and Sebastian cut their honeymoon short. The story of what happened, the fountain, the billionaire wife, the secret agent's son, became the stuff of Napa Valley legend, whispered at every charity gala and country club dinner for months. My parents tried to contact me. At first, it was a flood of panicked voicemails and long, rambling emails. They were a mix of clumsy apologies, accusations, and demands for an explanation. I didn't respond. I needed space. I needed to let the dust settle on the ruins of my old life before I could even think about what, if anything, could be salvaged. After a few months, the tone changed. My mother started sending short, simple texts. "Thinking of you. Hope you're well." They were hesitant, tentative feelers, like someone reaching out in the dark. And then, something truly shocking happened. My mother called me one Tuesday morning. "Your father has started seeing a therapist," she said, her voice quiet, "for anger management. It was my ultimatum. Either he got help, or I would file for a divorce." I was stunned into silence. Richard Vance, a man who saw therapy as a weakness for lesser men, was getting help. It was the first sign that real, foundational change might actually be possible. I still didn't rush back into their lives. The wounds were too deep for a quick fix. But for the first time, a tiny crack of light appeared in the wall I had built around my heart. The healing, I realized, wasn't just going to be for me. It had to be for them, too, if we were ever going to have any kind of future. It was a long road ahead, but it was no longer a dead end. About 8 months after the wedding, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Leo. His voice was hesitant, nothing like the confident, easygoing tone I was used to. He was in DC for a conference and asked if we could meet for coffee. A part of me wanted to say no, to keep that door firmly closed. But Aerys encouraged me to go. "You won't know until you know," she'd said. We met at a small, anonymous coffee shop far from the usual political haunts. He looked different, thinner, tired. The golden boy shine had been dulled. We made awkward small talk for a few minutes before he finally put his cup down and looked at me directly. "I'm sorry, Tyler," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything. For that night. For our whole lives, I guess." I just nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I was a coward," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I stood there and watched Dad treat you like dirt. And I didn't say a word. Not then, not ever. I just let it happen." "Why?" I asked. It was the only question that mattered. He stared into his coffee for a long moment. "Because I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone always thought I had it so easy. The favorite son. The one who got all the attention. But it was a prison in its own way. Their love, their approval. It was conditional. It was based entirely on my performance. On my grades, my awards, my career. The moment I slipped up, I knew that spotlight would turn cold." He looked up, and for the first time I saw genuine pain in his eyes. "You were the proof of that. You were the constant reminder of what happened when you didn't meet their expectations. So I played the part. I smiled, I achieved, I won. Then came the confession that changed everything. And a part of me was jealous of you," he said. I almost laughed. "Jealous of me? Leo, I lived in your shadow my entire life." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You got out. You built a life on your own terms, without their money or their approval. You had a freedom I never did. I was so busy trying to hold on to my place as the golden son, I never stopped to ask if it was a role I even wanted." He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. I think I liked being the favorite. It was just easier than questioning things. And for that, I am truly sorry. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase 30 years of hurt. But it was real. It was the first truly honest conversation we'd had in our entire lives. He wasn't just apologizing for his inaction. He was acknowledging the toxic system we grew up in, and his own complicity in it. He told me he and Sebastian were in counseling, trying to build a marriage based on a real partnership, not just the merger of two powerful families. He told me he was thinking of leaving my father's sphere of influence and joining a nonprofit, doing work that actually meant something to him. As I left the coffee shop that day, I realized the family inheritance I had once resented wasn't about money or property. It was about this cycle of conditional love and fear. And for the first time, it felt like my generation might just be the one to break it. It's been 3 years since that wedding. Our lives are good, really good. Aerys and I are expecting our first child, a daughter. We spend our weekends hiking with our dog, hosting game nights, and living a life that is blessedly, wonderfully normal, despite our very not normal jobs. My relationship with my family is a work in progress. It's not a fairy tale. The damage was too deep for that. But we're building something new. My father continues his therapy. We talk on the phone now, and he asks questions about my life. He's learning to listen. It's awkward and stilted sometimes, but it's a start. My mother has been making a real effort to get to know Aerys, to see her as a daughter-in-law and not just a celebrity CEO. Leo did leave his corporate law job. He now works for an international human rights organization. He and Sebastian seem happier, more genuine. We're not the closest of brothers, but we are brothers again. We're rebuilding one honest conversation at a time. A few months ago, my dad called me. "I was just looking at your old high school yearbooks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were captain of the soccer team. You won the state science fair. I never told you I was proud of you for any of that. I am so sorry, Tyler. I was a fool. I had to pull the car over, because I couldn't see the road through my own tears. It wasn't a magic fix. It didn't erase the fountain or the years of neglect. But it was an acknowledgement. It was a beginning. I've learned that family isn't just about the DNA you share. It's about who shows up. It's about who sees you, truly sees you, and loves you not in spite of your flaws, but because of the person you are, whole and complete. My true family is Aerys, our soon-to-be-born daughter, friends like Ben, and a circle of people who value me for my character, not my title. My old family is becoming a part of that circle now, slowly and carefully. They are learning that love isn't a reward for performance. It's the foundation you're supposed to build a life on. And I'm learning that sometimes the most broken things can be put back together, not as they were, but as something stronger. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know you best? I'd be honored if you shared some of your own thoughts or stories in the comments below. And please, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Your support truly means the world.